everybody. Welcome to the Focus Group podcast. I'm Sarah Longwell, publisher of the Bulwark, and I have a special episode for you today. We are going to do Pundit Accountability Day, and I have my buddy from the Bulwark, Will Saletan, here with me. Will, are you ready to do a Focus Group free Pundit Accountability podcast?
Oh, Sarah, I am terrified of accountability. All pundits are terrified of accountability.
Here's the thing. I got to tell you guys, the producer keeps telling me to back away from the mic. I'm like too jazzed up. But Georgia was just a real boon to the soul for those of us who are deeply concerned about democracy. And, you know, now that we've actually been through a bunch of races, right? We've got Pennsylvania behind us. We've got Ohio behind us. We've got now Georgia behind us. A lot of big ones. And one of the things I like to do is I like to re-listen to the Focus Group podcast after the election happens. I would actually encourage you guys to go check out the Pennsylvania episode or the Georgia episode now that you know the results, or the Ohio episode. It's fascinating because I got to tell you, it's not like I got a crystal ball, but the people do tell you a lot of the answers. There's a lot of that comes out of these groups that really does point the way to kind of what's going to happen. And so I wanted to just take some time without actually doing episodes of the Focus Group, but kind of look back at these races, talk about them, talk about how things evolved, and draw on what we learned from the focus groups that I think was very clear in the groups that not necessarily was predictive of the outcome, but was certainly giving us a lot of signs toward the outcome. So everyone's talking about the results of Georgia, or maybe just I'm the one talking about the results of Georgia because I can't get enough of it. My boy, Brad Raffensperger, pulled it out, got 52% of the vote, cleared the runoff threshold. He beat Congressman Jody Hice, who was a handpicked Donald Trump stooge, meant to be in the vote counting business in the next election. Will, what do you think? Is there anything better than Brad Raffensperger, who was public enemy number one of Donald Trump, winning in Georgia?
Yeah, so this race is interesting to me for two reasons. One is that Trump got it stuck to him, right? That he lost this race. The other one is this could serve as a really interesting deterrent to future opportunists. I mean, Jody Hice, to sort of leave his seat and go run for this race thinking that he had it in the bag because of Trump, and then just get smoked. That may discourage some others who are thinking of following Trump and doing the similar thing.
Okay, but let me ask you this, because I agree with you. Did you think Brad was going to win?
No. So first of all, outright, no way. The question was he going to hold Hice under 50? But it was totally the opposite. Nobody saw Raffensperger winning this outright on the first shot.
What polling were you looking at?
The pre-primary polls.
Okay. I'll just tell you a quick story about Raffensperger race. And full disclosure, in my other capacity as a strategist and somebody who does politics, I was involved in this race. One of the reasons I was involved is that I saw some public polling, maybe like 3 weeks ago. I can't remember which one either, that showed Raff and Hice neck and neck, like way closer. And so I will tell you, if you go back and listen to any of my commentary about Raffensperger, I definitely viewed him as kind of DOA. Part of it was because I had been doing focus groups in Georgia, and they were very pro Marjorie Taylor Greene, and they were very anti Brad Raffensperger. But a lot of those were, a year ago. And the assumption was that Donald Trump was going to be in the state hammering Kemp and Raffensperger just relentlessly. But the big thing that happened, the big change, was that because Purdue flamed out early, and it was going to be a big blemish and an embarrassment, right? We could all see it coming from a mile away that Kemp was going to win. Purdue was having pathetic events. No one was showing up. He wasn't raising any money. He wasn't putting in his own money, which meant that because he's a millionaire, which meant that he didn't have a whole lot of confidence in himself. And so Trump just isn't showing up to the state. He's too embarrassed. And as a result, he is not hammering people with the reminder of how Brad Raffensperger didn't find him as 11,000 votes. And I think that created this opening. So when a few weeks out, there's public polling showing Hice, Raffensperger neck and neck, and a bunch of undecideds. And so the PAC that I'm affiliated with and some other groups, we did a poll ourselves, and it showed that over 30% undecided. And that was when we decided, okay, it is worth engaging in this. And so there were a number of groups who in the last 10 days came in, put a bunch of money behind Raffensperger. And a lot of it was just positive branding. And one of the groups that I know has gone on the record talking about what they did is a group called Country First, which is an Adam Kinzinger aligned PAC that put a bunch of, I think, like 1.4 million into the race. So there's two things that happened. One, Kemp's coattails were really long. I mean, I don't think everyone knew he was going to win, but like it was just such a blowout. Raffensperger was the incumbent. And so he just had more name ID. And one of the things that came up in the focus groups, and I tweeted about it at the time, and it was another reason that we thought it really made sense that the race was within reach, was because nobody knew who Jody Heiss was. And when you asked voters, Republican voters, what do you think of Jody Heiss? Their answer was, never heard of her. And so here's my question. Do you think misogyny played a role in Brad Raffensperger winning?
Oh my goodness. It's possible. That's possible. That I love that story. I know you and Tim talked about that, the who is she thing. As one of the unaccountable pundits, I saw the same public numbers you did, and I assumed Republican voters, they'll go with the Trump person. And obviously that didn't happen. Your explanation is starting to give me an answer as to why that didn't happen. But I got to tell you, Sarah, I'm kind of shocked because of this is one of the polls that I looked at, April poll. I cannot remember. This might have been University of Georgia. It might have been somebody else. But the Kemp versus Raffensperger, there was a big gap, okay? Among Republican primary voters, Kemp's approval numbers were like 55-25. Raffensperger was the reverse, right? He was 25-55. In fact, Raffensperger was doing better in terms of his job approval with Democrats than he was with Republicans. It's fascinating to me the dynamic that you're describing where Kemp, although he did better than Raffensperger among Republican voters, he essentially sort of ran cover for Raffensperger in terms of keeping Trump out of the state.
Yeah, although you bring up another key feature of this race. And I got to tell you, I am, when I say I'm coming off, I'm feeling really excited and good. Part of it is that my great hope for this country is that there is sort of a big, broad pro-democracy coalition that can come together. And that is sort of what happened. There were, at least right now, according to Kyle Kondik, there were 40,000 Dems that cast early primary ballots. Okay, 40,000 Democrats pulled a Republican ballot in Georgia so that they could vote in this primary. And they voted for Kemp and Raffensperger. So Raffensperger was 27,000 votes ahead of the 50% cutoff. And so 40,000 votes from Democrats in this race made a huge difference for Brad Raffensperger. I'm so heartened by that.
Yeah, and actually, so I saw, you can tell me whether these numbers are realistic or not, but the Washington Post did an analysis where they estimated that there were 77,000 voters who voted in the Republican primary in Georgia this year who had voted in the Democratic primary in 2020. So they can't prove that these are all Democrats who crossed over, but like that would even add to your argument.
Yeah, I think people are still kind of sifting through and trying to figure out, but there's just no doubt there was a relatively uncontested Democratic primary. Stacey Abrams was running uncontested. And so I just want to do a shout out to all the Democrats who were thoughtful enough to say, I'm going to pull a Republican ballot and I'm going to make my voice heard. Because, it's not like Democrats love Brad Raffensperger. He does lots of things that I'm sure they don't like. And here's the thing. Brad Raffensperger is probably going to be harder to beat in a general election than Jody Heiss would have been. And so I think that was like a genuinely pro-democracy, vaguely self-sacrificing move from those Democrats. And I just think it's exactly what we need in this moment. Do you have something to add to that?
Usually I think of this in terms of Republicans, right? I'm thinking you Republican voters need to decide that democracy is more important than all the other issues that you're looking at. I know you're concerned about inflation, you're concerned about the border, you're concerned about crime, but the number one thing you need to look at which candidate will defend democracy and will not promote election lies and will not talk about overthrowing future elections. And I'm thinking about them crossing over and voting for the Democrat. You're talking here about a really interesting reversal. Will Democrats cross over and vote for a Republican for exactly the same reason, that standing for democracy is more important than all the other issues on the table?
Yep, it's the best. But what do you think? Do you think that just the blowout from Kemp and then even Raffensperger clearing, does that portend a diminishing grip on the party by Trump?
Well, yes. I mean, over time, Trump's grip, unless Trump gets reelected president, will continue to diminish. The sort of question to me is, how big is it at this point? First of all, it's declining, but also, as you've seen in the primaries, it varies enormously from race to race, how much of an effect he had. And a lot of it is how much other information was there about the respective candidates. If all you know is that Trump endorsed candidate A over candidate B, then that was a significant factor. But I looked at polling basically in 4 states, in Pennsylvania, Ohio, in Georgia, and North Carolina. And what I saw was, in general, Trump's endorsement made a much bigger impact where voters didn't already know the candidates well. Like, Trump endorsing against an incumbent was generally a failure, right? That was just not very effective. But Trump endorsing, among a couple of challengers nobody knew about was a big deal. Also, who else was endorsing in the race? In Pennsylvania, Trump's endorsing Oz, but you got a bunch of other Republican luminaries coming in for McCormick. And so that kind of counterbalanced Trump's effect. And the other thing I would say, Sarah, is on the hard numbers. If you ask people, does it make you much more likely or much less likely to vote for candidate A because Trump, that actually was almost a wash in a lot of places, like 4 points, 2 points, really small margins. So it made a difference. But if one candidate, for other reasons, had like a 5-point lead or more, then Trump's endorsement was not enough to overcome that.
So that's interesting. And I got to say, we ask in every focus group whether or not Trump's endorsement matters to people. And they usually kind of say no. I remember asking this in the Ohio group, which is a super interesting episode to go back and listen to, because we asked this question. They were all like, no, I'm going to make up my own mind, whatever. Except that something that was really clear in the group is that they had all belatedly just realized that they like JD Vance. I think if you ask people to sort of say whether or not Trump's endorsement really matters, like, people want to be independent minded, and especially if they're saying it out loud to a group or like to a pollster. But I think that there's just no doubt in the open primaries, where I think in Pennsylvania, in Ohio, where everybody's watching these guys just like nuke each other and they're kind of looking for something to help them decide. I think that's where Trump's endorsement can really help. And look, going into that Ohio primary, Tony Fabrizio, who was Trump's pollster, who was working for Vance, had put together this whole like detailed polling analysis on like, hey, if you endorse Vance, he's going to shoot to first place. And that's exactly what happened in that primary. And so I do think it has a lot to do too with these like open primaries versus in Georgia. Like, and this is one of the things I keep saying to people, where they're like, well, what is it about Georgia voters that is so different from all of these others that they were totally resistant to Trump doing this? And I was like, it's not that exactly. It's incumbency is an incredibly potent force. These voters actively like Brian Kemp. They think he did a good job on COVID. They thought that he got their kids back in school, which a lot of people said in the focus groups. They said things like, he has an actual impact on my life, which is one of the reasons, I think he outran Raffensperger so much, is that he's been able to really strike a brand for himself that is affirmative. Here's all the stuff I do for you. And he passed that election integrity bill, election integrity in quotation marks. He was able to blunt the criticism that he didn't do enough. Anyway, I think that Trump's endorsement matters. I don't think it is like a magic thing that can overcome normal political gravity stuff like incumbency, which is huge. State races and national races are totally different. I think voters are much more willing to give the finger to sort of national candidates in a way that the state level candidates actually have impact on their lives. And so it can't all just be culture war all the way down.
Yeah. So one of the interesting things to me about the Trump endorsement as a phenomenon is, first of all, what is it about, right? It's not really about anything other than personal loyalty to Donald Trump, right? And so, as you're pointing out in the Kemp case, if you, as a Republican officeholder, have a solid conservative record in all other respects, like you're the first governor to reopen during COVID, that kind of thing, and the schools are open and people are happy about that, and you are pretty well insulated against this, because a lot of these voters are like, okay, so Trump's endorsing the other person, but like, why would I go against Kemp? Like, all the reasons why I like Trump are reasons why I like Kemp.
Right.
And so I think that protects a lot of these candidates. The other thing is, Trump's endorsement is so driven by his obsession with election fraud and relitigating 2020. And the polling generally shows that although Republican primary voters agree with Trump about the sort of gospel of like Joe Biden was illegitimately elected, yada, yada. They don't want to relitigate this. They don't want to go back and talk about 2020. When they were asked about that directly in a couple of states, they said, yeah, no, I want to move on, right? They don't want to like jail everybody who was involved in January 6th, but for the same reason, they don't want to go argue endlessly about the 2020 election. And so to the extent that Trump's endorsements were about relitigating 2020 rather than about conservatism, a lot of Republican voters said, we're going to go with the conservative, not with the relitigator.
I only half agree with that. Let me tell you why. So let's just take Pennsylvania for 1 second. So in Pennsylvania, Doug Mastriano, he's a cute, curious lunatic who sent buses to January 6th. He belatedly, when it was clear he was going to win, earned Trump's endorsement. And he himself, this QAnon bus January 6th crazy person, endorsed another January 6th crazy person, Kathy Barnett. And then Donald Trump, though, he endorsed Dr. Oz. So there was like the person that Trump put his hands on and said, this is my guy, Oz, who, by the way, the focus groups absolutely hated. And it's why Dr. Oz actually did pretty well in these like rural areas because the Trump endorsement matters. Again, and it looks like Oz is going to eke it out. But if you add up the Oz vote and the Kathy Barnett vote, assuming that one is the person Trump actually touched and the other one is the true MAGA candidate, that equals over 50% of voters in Pennsylvania. And so I guess the thing that I keep wanting people to not miss, and the reason I don't like these Trump is grip is slipping analyses, is that even though McCormick, who had the lowest negatives in the group that we had, like I tweeted after the Pennsylvania group that I thought that McCormick was going to edge it out by a smidge, just because they hated him a little bit less. And it looks like that's not going to be the case, but it is within hundreds of votes. But it's the way that Trump has transformed the party. And so when people obsess about just the man Trump and just the endorsement Trump, they're not thinking about the fact that he has radically altered the state of the party, changed it in his image to the point where every nominee in these primaries, Trump can't endorse all of them, but they all endorse him, with the exception of Matt Dolan in Ohio. These guys are all in for him, whether it's the Alabama primary, the Pennsylvania primary, and even in Georgia. It's not like Kemp ran as an anti-Trump candidate. Like you just said this, and I think it's exactly right. He is viewed by the voters as perfectly in line with the combative America First agenda that Trump embodies. No?
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, first of all, in Ohio, for example, I think that goes to your point about like all the candidates in Ohio sort of went Trumpy, except Dolan, right? And I think one of the reasons why Vance got a big boost was if you're a Republican voter in Ohio and you're looking at these guys, Mandel and Vance and the others, and you're like, how do I choose among them? That Trump coming in and saying Vance is the guy, at that point, it's hard for you to distinguish among them. Whereas I think in a race where there's an incumbent who has a record, with somebody who has other factors involved, like I think the endorsement has less of an effect there. So I think that goes to your point. The thing in Georgia is kind of interesting because Kemp's record on, say, signing the Georgia election reform bill, that was a big deal. And some of the polling that I saw indicated that a lot of Republican primary voters in Georgia, something like 60% of them said that they felt much more confident about election integrity more than in other states. They trusted that elections would be right. So what Kemp was able to do with this bill was basically to appease these voters, to reassure them. And they didn't have to go with sort of election denial. They didn't have to go with Purdue. They could get in Kemp a guy who was conservative and who had signed an election reform bill and thereby addressed their concerns about that.
So that's exactly right. And I think people forget that election bill, like he ended up in a fight with Coca-Cola and Major League Baseball, who pitched a fit about that bill. And a lot of people really got upset about that bill. And so he got to look like the DeSantis with Disney, the guy standing up to the woke corporations in favor of, election integrity. And people, I think, just don't realize how much that kind of wiped the anti-Trump stink off of him. The other thing that you said earlier that I just want to really highlight because it's so true, whether or not voters really know who Trump's endorsing. Everybody kind of in DC assumes that voters all have the same perfect information and they're poring over the endorsement list. I can't tell you how often in a focus group we say, well, Trump has endorsed so-and-so. And people are like, oh, I didn't know he'd endorsed him. And they usually know with the big Senate candidates, but on governors or any lower office, nobody knew that Trump had endorsed Jody Heiss. I mean, they didn't know who Jody Heiss was. So it is, taking some of those things into consideration is important. That Donald Trump is just, he has a presence, but they're not like tracking his endorsements.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's true. I mean, Trump, back when Trump had his Twitter account, everybody would sort of know right away what Trump had said. I want to say one thing, though, back to your point about Kemp and the Georgia elections bill and how many people he pissed off with that bill. One of the strangest things to me about that story is that bill, that law that he signed in Georgia, was way, way overplayed.
Totally.
And the liberals sort of portrayed it as like he's like suppressing the vote. If you actually read the details of the bill, like it was fine. He got the DeSantis effect because liberals went nuts over the bill and portrayed it as Jim Crow. I think Kemp got a lot of credit on the right for people who like Jim Crow.
And they want Jim Crow, right? Sure. That's right.
And even though the bill itself didn't warrant that.
Exactly right. I saw a quote from myself in Newsweek, and I had forgotten I'd given this interview, and it was about DeSantis. And I had said, the left's rage is the spinach that he eats to make him stronger every day. And like, it's just true with these governors, and you're right. I mean, the worst thing in that election bill was they demoted Brad Raffensperger. Like there was like a punitive action against him and what he could do in his role. And that was like one of the worst things. So much of it was ephemera and was just reinstating some things that had been changed during COVID. And I do think this has been one of the limitations of people who are working on voting rights, is the ability to distinguish between really bad bills. And because I do think there was some stuff in this bill that was bad, but it was nothing like the Texas bill or some of the other ones that have come out that are really horrible.
Here we're talking about the large question of sort of where is America at this point, and there's sort of a good and bad in the Georgia story. The good is the bill itself in Georgia was not nearly as radical as it was portrayed. I mean, it looked like it had been written by somebody who like wanted to sort of have reasonable reforms, but wanted to look like they were appeasing the red meat base, right? And so, and I agree with you. I think we're probably in agreement that the part about like what happens after an election, where they're like messing with the role of the Secretary of State, that's the scary stuff. But on the other hand, it worries me a little bit that despite the bill being sensible by and large, the Republicans felt the need to sort of play to the negative partisanship of whatever the other side is for, we're against. I think that's a fundamentally dangerous and large corrosive force in this country right now. So it worries me. I mean, they did, what was it? That they had a signing ceremony and there were no Democrats, and one, I think it was a legislator, a black woman, wants to get in, they keep her out. So they make it look like a racial thing. They make it look like a partisan thing when it didn't need to be. So I'm glad that in fact the bill wasn't, but it worries me that they wanted to portray it that way.
It's so funny. I mean, I think that there's something about the narrative right now when people are like, the establishment comes back. And I'm like, okay, 7 years ago, the way that Kemp conducts himself would have been seen as a very extreme Republican. And this is, it's like Katie Britt. Okay, at some point we should talk about Alabama. I love this race. But Katie Britt is seen as the establishment candidate. She too has flirted with election denialism. She ran on like building the wall. That was like her big thing. And this is where I just sort of have to laugh at, to use a phrase, the Overton window on establishment has moved 11 paces Trumpward, and it has lost the meaning of establishment. And to your point, like, Kemp is a perfect culture warrior in his state who's fighting against Stacey Abrams. I mean, that was the one other thing I just should point out that Kemp really had going for him. And even Raffensperger, it wasn't like anybody ran a campaign that they were the pro-democracy, Republican. I call them pro-democracy, and I actually took a bunch of crap for this on Twitter for calling them pro-democracy. But what I mean is, we know they won't overturn elections because they've demonstrated that they won't. And now I'm really talking about Kemp because I think Raffensperger was a totally different category. Like, this is a guy who went toe-to-toe with Trump, released the conversation of Donald Trump telling him to find 11,000 votes, like really fought with him and really was a sort of a warrior for democracy. But they all ran as, against Stacey Abrams and sort of the liberals. And it wasn't like anybody was trying to run as the pro-democracy Republican.
Yeah, what I had hoped as a reasonable person, and I'm sure what you had hoped too, was that basically that there would be an emerging Republican position that was sort of anti-Trump or at least anti-election lies, right? We're not going to lie about the election. We're going to admit that Joe Biden was legitimately elected, that all these claims of election fraud didn't pan out in court, nothing checked out. What's actually happened is that people who don't want to take the craziest Trump position that the election was stolen have sort of finessed it. I mean, Lindsey Graham's term for this, there were a lot of shenanigans in it. And the shenanigans doesn't have to mean fraud. The shenanigans means they changed the rules about absentee ballots. Well, of course, because a pandemic came in during the year, right? But that is somehow supposed to appease the base and is supposed to appease Trump in a way without actually saying that the election was fraudulent.
We're going to talk about Alabama in just a second, but first we're going to take a quick break. It doesn't take a genius to realize we're headed back to the 70s, with inflation at an all-time high and the feds sounding the alarm. But every cloud has a silver lining. In fact, I've found what I'm calling the 1970s opportunity. Because while the 70s weren't perfect, a lot of things were. Housing prices weren't insane, people could still afford food, and gold soared from $200 to $2,500 per ounce in the following decade. While gold is at a high today, the 1970s opportunity today ain't gold. It's a $1.7 trillion market, over 275 years old. It's been making the rich even richer, and this opportunity is being swept under the rug. But our listeners can uncover the rest of the story at masterworks.io and use promo code Focus Group. That's masterworks.io, promo code Focus Group. Before deciding to invest, carefully review Regulation A disclosures at masterworks.io/CD. Again, that's masterworks.io, code Focus Group. All right, we're back talking about the primaries with Bulwark's Will Saletan. Can we talk about the Alabama race for just 1 second?
Sure.
Because what I love about this race, and this is going back to sort of pundit accountability, and the episode we did, it was Georgia and Alabama we did at the same time. It was interesting in the focus group because the group really hated Katie Britt. Like somebody knew her, somebody like, this is like Alabama, somebody's daughter went to high school with her. And the rap on Britt was that she was kind of a striver. You know, she's a cheerleader and she always wanted to win. And boy, it was just, they really seemed to hate that about her. But I would say the group was pretty middle-aged to older. But Katie Britt came out on top. But the thing that I took away from the group, like my big takeaway was that, you know what, I think Mo Brooks is more in this than people think because they all really liked Mo Brooks. Many of them had sort of taken a dance with Durant, but this like Lincoln Project connection that was really just about having sort of some of the same donors going into a PAC supporting Durant that had also gone to the Lincoln Project. You know, they were able to just sort of tag him with the Lincoln Project, and it cratered him. Because after Trump unendorsed Mo Brooks because he was running third and called him woke, Durant immediately grabbed the mantle and said, oh no, I am the one who is going to make sure that, you know, when I'm elected, we're going to deal with the number one issue concerning Alabamans, which is that stolen election from 2020. And so voters had all taken a spin with him and then decided, no thanks. And so people had kind of come back to Brooks in the focus group. And, you know, ultimately, Katie Britt kind of ran away with it. I mean, she got almost 45%, but Brooks got nearly 30%. And Durant is sort of at the bottom with his sad 23%. Are you surprised Mo Brooks, after living at the bottom, kind of had a resurgence?
I can't believe it, Sarah, that I ended up cheering for Mo Brooks. I mean, here's a guy who was at the January 6th rally wearing what, like a bulletproof vest or something. I forget what it was. The guy's nuts from my point of view. I think objectively nuts. And just the fact that Trump unendorsed him, that just like, all right, that makes him not a never Trumper, but a not always Trumper. So I ended up cheering for this guy. I'm happy for that. But it's mostly, I think this really sticks it to the sort of lie about the Trump endorsement, which is Donald Trump, a person who cares about other people, would endorse candidates based on what they would do in office, right? And Trump is not interested in that. Trump is interested in padding his own record, right? He wants to be the guy with the perfect endorsement record. And one of the ways that you would do that is you unendorse people who are losing, not because they're not, sufficiently loyal to you, but they're going to lose and you don't want that to be on your record, right? So he betrays this guy. So to me, the fact that Brooks comes back is sort of an illustration that very often Donald Trump's endorsement is a trailing indicator, right? He's not looking at it and saying, who can I help to win? He's saying, who's gonna win? So if I endorse them, that adds to my record.
This is just like a tactical mistake. If he'd endorsed Katie Britt, because everybody went down to Mar-a-Lago, including Katie Britt, and she's got some like football player husband. And so For a while, there was some sense that maybe Trump would switch his endorsement to her because they looked, quote unquote, straight out of central casting. And he loves people straight out of central casting. And so him not endorsing her, to the extent that this is a parlor game now, had he placed his bets a little better, she could have avoided the runoff. But now she's going to be in a runoff with Mo Brooks. Durant also endorsed Brooks.
Right.
Which I think is funny because, he was supposed to be, according to the chatter on the back end, the like fake never Trump candidate. Like the reason that the Lincoln Project stuff stuck, I think, is that there was the sense that he was running fake MAGA. When it came down to it, he would do the right thing. But I don't know, man. Maybe it's just because people can smell that phoniness.
Oh, okay. So I wasn't in the focus group that you were in Alabama. The whiff that I'm getting off of what you're telling me is, how much do you think sexism is a factor in this race and will be a factor in the runoff?
Well, this was what was sort of almost stunning to me. I've been rooting for Britt the whole time. I always thought, by rooting, I'm going to just say they're all bad. I don't like any of them, but this is Alabama. And so we need to be like, okay, one of these people is going to be in the United States Senate. Who is the least bad person for that? And Katie Britt, who has worked for Shelby for a long time, I think if the environment were different, she might even be somebody that I would have quite liked. She should be the candidate. But then when I was listening to this focus group, talk about something making me more on her side, listening to the way that they talked about her made me furious. They were super misogynistic. Like it felt, look, I think I said this on that podcast that I'm not one for cheerleaders as a concept, right? Cheerleading. I just like the people who stand on the sidelines and like cheer for the people playing. I've never understood it. Although there is a really great Netflix show called Cheer that did change my opinion on cheerleading just slightly. Amazing athletes, the one who do it like as gymnasts, really incredible. Anyway, the knock on her that she was this striver, this cheerleader, did to me smack of kind of a real anti-woman trying to win. Like that was the one woman was being like, she's always wanted to win. I was like, oh, God forbid. I'm sorry. Isn't the whole thing about Donald Trump that he's a winner? Isn't that the whole thing Republican likes, people who want to win? My like sisterhood thing kicked in. And I was like, yeah. I'm about to intervene on Katie Britt's behalf, which is not a thing I was going to do. But I do wonder head to head with Brooks, whether or not Britt still makes it.
Yeah, I gotta say, Sarah, that in the invisible thesaurus in my head, the way the words are networked, striver or climber or whatever it was that you heard in the focus group is like, that's real close to uppity. And, the fact that they hold it against her that she's sort of, been in politics is part that, to me, that sort of resonates with the general sort of Trump phenomenon of we want an outsider. But then Mo Brooks has been there forever. So I really don't know how that plays.
And also, the thing about runoffs is that participation drops. And so it really comes down to who turns out in these runoffs. And I'm not sure that the kind of middle-aged to older constituency that still get the warm fuzzies from Brooks because he's just been around, that they don't kind of all come home to him. I'm not sure. But I will carry with me the fact that they did not like her.
So one other thing about Katie Britt, you were saying before that in another environment, she would be sort of a reasonable, normal Republican. Do you believe that that is in fact what she is and that she's just finessing her way through this Trump stuff and that Donald Trump will fade away from the scene, he will die or disappear or something, and that if she is the senator from Alabama, she'll be fine?
I do. In a way that I actually didn't believe of Durant. And part of it, though, is I know people who know her. I actually know people who know both of them. It's so pathetic what you have to look for in people to kind of like know their hearts. But I'm familiar with this dance. I used to do it on gay marriage. Like we all knew that George W. Bush, despite running a horrible wedge effort, everybody knew that the Bushes were, fine with gay marriage and had gay people in their lives. And I'll leave it for a different podcast, whether or not that kind of cynicism is actually worse than like a Rick Santorum type who's real about it. But anyway, the point is there's this thing that people do where you can sort of pick up the signals of whether or not somebody really believes the thing or whether they're doing it to get elected. And with the stakes as high as they are and no viable Democrat in Alabama, there is a reason to say, okay, who do we think isn't going to overturn an election? People know at this point what Donald Trump's game is. You come to Mar-a-Lago, you seek his endorsement. He says you got to do two things. You got to say you're not going to vote for Mitch McConnell as leader, and you're going to say the election was stolen. And I think the fact Durant, right after the unendorsement of Mo Brooks, Durant came charging out with the, election was stolen, number one issue for voters. She never did. I mean, she did kind of at one point, she said she'd object to the 2020 results, but I think Trump would have endorsed her if she'd given her commitment to saying that the election was stolen. And instead, she kind of did like the Youngkin McCormick move. You can tell who like the secret ones are who actually hate Trump because they do the move where they won't quite go as far as the election was stolen. And instead, they sort of talk about integrity and, examining the results. And they have this line that you can only see if you know it's there. That is between saying the election was stolen versus, well, you got to look at the results. And I would have looked at 2020, that's the tell.
Right. I feel like sometimes we're living in sort of the story of like an unfolding religion. The religion is Trumpism. And so one guy, Donald Trump, can come out and say something crazy about the election being stolen and stick to it. And it's fascinating to watch how that bends the whole force field of everybody trying to find a way to appease this one madman while at the same time not exactly leaving touch with reality. And that position you just described is it.
Yeah. Are there any other states that you have watched where you've been surprised at how Trump's endorsement has played?
Well, the ones that have happened so far, it's varied so much from one to another. There's a difference between how people say the endorsement will affect them and how they actually vote. Some of the returns came in higher or lower than I expected. One of the most interesting polls that I saw was in North Carolina, where they asked people if they wanted a nominee who was similar to Trump. And it was basically like 85% of the Republican primary voters wanted a nominee similar to Trump. But then they sort of broke it down into sort of Trumpy on the issues versus Trumpy in personality, Trump, in terms of things like tone and style. And basically they cut it in half. Like there's in the Republican primary electorate, there's like 40% who love like Trump, everything about Trump, and want candidates who are like him. And then there's another like 45% who they like populist conservatism. They like what they think of as Trumpism, but they don't want the candidate to behave like Trump. I don't know how to describe them, Sarah. They're anti-Trump in a way, but they're pro-Trumpism. And without them, you can't win a Republican primary.
Can I just say I don't think they're anti-Trump? In the focus groups all the time, I ask this question, all of them, in every group, I ask about 2024. And always about half the group wants Trump to run again outright. But then the other half is like, well, I don't know. I'd like him to be involved, be a kingmaker, but I think we need somebody younger. And they have a bunch of perfectly valid points. Trump is getting older. They'd like to see somebody younger like Ron DeSantis, who, by the way, is basically made in Trump's image and just doesn't quite have Trump's baggage, but is very Trumpy in style. One of the main problems people see for Trump, it comes up all the time, and it's such a smart, obvious point that people don't think about, which is, why would I vote for Trump again, who only gets 4 years, when I could have Ron DeSantis, who could get 8 years? Like, Trump only gets one more term. And that's completely right. And a completely pragmatic way to look at Trump and Trumpism is, okay, well, look, there's a bunch of junior Trumps now who can give me 8 years of the kind of populist Republican rule and keep out these socialist Dems. And that's what I'm reaching for. I don't think any of it's anti-Trump.
Okay, I won't call it anti-Trump. And actually, Sarah, this conversation is just driving home to me how beaten down I am that at this point in America's decline, but it matters a lot to me that the people who are going to elect a senator in Alabama or wherever it is, that the Republican primary electorate in those states, that they at least agree we're going to allow votes to be certified for the actual winner of the vote. And people who will do that, people who will say that much, if those voters want to be Trumpy on issues like, all the polling I saw was like inflation is the number one issue among Republican primary voters. Immigration, border stuff, pretty clearly number two. I don't like that. I don't like the whole anti-immigrant thing going on in the party. I think it's corrosive to America, dangerous in a lot of ways. But it's much more important to me that the voters are going to at least choose somebody who will not literally overturn the will of the people in the 2 weeks after an election.
Oh, I got bad news for you, bro. Here's the thing. I am optimistic about people. I do all these groups, and I think that in the Trump groups, as frustrated as I get, so many of the people in them are incredibly lovely people. They're very recognizable to me. And I get so much hate mail if I say something in an op-ed that's like, these are not bad or unintelligent people. Man, nothing generates hate mail like me saying that these Trump voters are neither bad nor unintelligent. But they do not care about democracy. at least not the way you're thinking about it. It's funny. I do try to cite this whenever I get put in a position to, which is CNN last year did a really good poll, and there's been a couple others about threat to democracy. And who do you think thought that democracy was most under threat?
Oh, Republicans.
Yeah, but they think it's under threat because the elections are being stolen from them.
Exactly.
And so the problem is that what you want are like, Republicans are like, why won't overturn an election? But actually, Adam Kinzinger said this on one of these episodes where he was like, recognize when the bad guys think they're the good guys. And I'm not saying that these voters are bad guys, but I will say, like, they will overturn democracy in the name of protecting democracy, if that makes sense, right? The people who stormed the Capitol think they're the good guys. They think they're the ones protecting democracy from an election that was stolen from them, which is why, to me, the great villains of our time, the great people who are just absolutely the threat to democracy, are less these voters and much more Tucker Carlson and Josh Hawley. But the people who tell the lies, who prey on people's patriotism and pervert it into a kind of corrosive nationalism and tell them lies about an election being stolen, they're lying to people. And they're the ones generating this issue.
Yes. And Sarah, you're bringing me back. This was the first piece that I wrote for the Bulwark, which was exactly on this point, that the voters who are a danger to democracy in this country are not anti-democratic. They're pro-democratic. They just believe the lies that the Tucker Carlsons and others have told them. So they think they're saving democracy when in fact they're trying to overturn the election. When I look forward and ask myself how far this will go and, how bad will the Trump movement get in terms of threatening American democracy, there are some general elections coming up that I'm looking at. As you point out, I confess, yes, Doug Mastriano won going away in the governor's race in Pennsylvania. He's not just an election denier. He was involved in January 6th and the buses and all that. And so, number one, he has to go down, and I think he will. And that's a race that Republicans might otherwise have won. So that would be a good sign for democracy. We've got different species of election deniers coming up in the Arizona elections. So I think that, Mark Fincham is like an absolute denier, and Brnovich is not quite a denier, but sort of in that middle ground that we were talking about. So I'm curious to see how the different positions play out. But yeah, the absolute deniers must lose their general elections, or we are in deep trouble.
I could not agree more. Will Saletan, thank you so much for coming and doing the Pundit Accountability Roundup. I really wanted to explore whether or not the focus groups were kind of getting it right. And I'm the one making the case that I feel like, whether it was seeing the opening for Raffensperger, whether it was understanding why people liked Kemp, whether, engaging sort of Trump's endorsement, his hold on the party. I just think the focus groups have not been leading us astray. And so I hope all of you have been enjoying the focus group podcast. We will be back next week with an episode about abortion, talking to suburban women. We've been really looking forward to bringing it to you. Our guest is Rachel Vindman, and host of the Suburban Woman Problem podcast. But Will, thanks again for joining us.
Thanks, Sarah. And there's just one thing I wanted to say about those focus groups. I love that you do this. And sometimes, being a nerd I am, I think, focus groups are kind of small sample size. You can get things wrong with it. But then part of me says, how was the number of people in the focus group more than 0? Because 0 is the number of ordinary people most pundits are actually listening to. So even just to get like a dozen people or whatever in a room, real people, just broadens the conversation and injects a dose of reality that pundits really need to hear.
Well, thanks for saying that, man. I happen to completely agree with that. And, we do groups every week. And so I'm not saying that we get poll scale. We certainly don't. But we do talk to enough people to get a real sense of the trends. But thanks for listening. And thanks for coming on.
Thank you.
Thanks to all of you. We will see you next time